Our next panel, I'm very happy to introduce. This is responding to the big deltas, workers, employers, and government. As we talked about earlier, technology and AI will certainly be a work disruptor. And what was touched on a little bit in that panel was how there are other demographic drivers that are going to be equal disruptors, shrinking populations, longer lived societies, that will change and are changing how we think about work and careers. And also, as importantly, how we think about the role of employers, government, and individuals. So I am very happy to introduce the moderator of this panel, Jialu Streeter, because Jialu was one of us. She was a professor of economics at Allegheny College, joined the Stanford Center on Longevity 5 or 6 years ago, where we got to indoctrinate her in everything longevity. And now she, I guess happily, the Stanford Institute on Economic Policy and Research stole her from us, where she is now the executive director, working with external partners, government and policy organizations. A little known fact about Jialu, she is on a YouTube influencer. She had a 2022 documentary called Homelessness in California that received over 800,000 views. She's also a classically trained pianist and the mother of 2 small children. So in her spare time. So thank you, Jialu.
Thank you so much, Martha, the longevity team for inviting me back. Such a pleasure. And I just want to add, I also have a cat in addition to, so that's very important. So such a pleasure to be here. I want to first introduce the panel and also, then we can jump into conversations. So here we have 3 great panelists. I want to start with the middle. Karen Kimbrough is the chief economist at LinkedIn, where she leads a team of economists and data scientists. And together they are dedicated to study how the world of work is evolving. They use a large amount of data, which is super important to understand workplace trends, career opportunities, and the type of jobs and industries around the world. So fun fact, Karen here, she's also a Stanford alum so she completed her undergraduate studies in Stanford, and then she moved on to Harvard and University of Oxford. So here on my right side, we have Barb Marder. Barb is the president and CEO at the Employee Benefit Research Institute, also known as EBRI. And so before EBRI, she had several senior leadership positions at Mercer, where she focused on innovation hub, global mobility, and global defined contribution consulting. And Barb joined EBRI in March 2023. So now, as the new CEO of EBRI, she's looking to enhance the usability of data and analytics and focus on the impactful research work on both health and wealth. And last but not least, Amanda. So Amanda Renteria is the CEO of Code for America. So Code for America is a nonprofit organization that works with government and local community, and then they modernize and digitalize government programs on employment, housing, health, and education. So before Code for America, Amanda was the chief of operations at California Department of Justice, and before that, she was the national political director for Hillary Clinton's 2016 presidential campaign. So we have the 3 very great panelists here, and I think they're going to offer us very different perspectives from individuals, from the employers, from the government perspectives. So during this conference so far, I feel like we've talked a lot about big trends, big changes. So we know we're living for longer century lives, and also newer generations of workers now may have very different preferences, right? So maybe in the past, in my parents' generation, it's like one job, and then that's their job they're going to have for life. And now people are, holding multiple jobs, and maybe they're moving from one place to another. So I want to start with Karen, because you're at LinkedIn, you have a ton of data. So I want to ask you, what do you think of this flexible work schedule? And also during the pandemic, a lot of people have moved out of urban centers because it's expensive, and then they move to more remote areas. So do you see any reversal of that, or is the work from home going to stay with us?
Yeah, sure. So good afternoon. Thanks for having me, Jialu. It's nice to see you again. So I just to kind of frame what I'm going to say. So I'm going to talk about the data that we have at LinkedIn, which is covering about 1 billion users now. We just hit the billion mark. Doesn't mean everybody's on LinkedIn all the time, though that would be nice. But it gives us a chance to see when people's profiles, where they went to school, what training they have, what skills they have, what roles they're holding when they get promoted, when they leave, and so forth. So it gives a really kind of nice picture on one side of what professionals are doing, and then on the other side, what employers are looking for, because employers, 65 million of them, are putting job postings up. So we can see what skills they're looking for, what roles are available, what industries are hiring. So what I see in terms of flexibility, really quickly, we saw this amazing, and no surprise to any of you, trend in which remote work became incredibly popular during the pandemic. It went from being largely something that tech companies sort of offered to some folks to nearly every industry that could offered it. So obviously we didn't see as much remote work in hospitals and healthcare, or as much remote work in the hotel industry, but we saw it in just for nearly any job you can imagine. And so we went from somewhere where there might have been like maybe 5% of the jobs offered remote work to about over 20. Now we're back down to about 10%. It's going back down. Employers are pulling back on that flexibility of remote work. Because when I look at remote, what I see is flexibility. I see autonomy and flexibility. And I think my co-panelists will speak more to that. So what we're seeing is employers are pulling back on remote, but here's the funny part. When people apply, they nearly all apply to at least one remote role, and 40% of all the job applications, 40% go to remote jobs, even though remote jobs are only about 10% of the apps. So people like it. Nobody misses their commute, I keep saying. So we're still seeing that happen. Actually, what's really happening, underlying trend, is that hybrid is starting to just gradually, from your perspective, increase over time. So I think hybrid is the way that we're going to end up with like something like a 4-day work week, where people are maybe checked in for 4 days and working from home for 2 or something like that. I will say that employers want to bring everybody back in 5 days a week, though. They would like that. They're looking for that. So that's the remote flexibility thing. And one of the things I would also just quickly add, because you asked about it, Jialu, is this idea of people having more than one job. We definitely see that. We see people starting to job stack. Everyone has a couple of different things they do. Not everyone, many people do. Many people don't think they're going to stay at their job until they're 65 and then go home and sit on the couch. They have what they call the next play. What am I doing after this? And so there's a lot more dynamism now in terms of how people think about their jobs and in their relationship to their employer. It's not as if you're getting married to life to IBM, you start there and you never leave. It's much more dynamic. It's more like a dating pool than a marriage. And then you asked one last thing, and then I will pass it back to you. Jialu asked me about just trends. We see also where people are moving. And so one of the things that we observed, of course, during the pandemic, is a lot of people left, guess what? San Francisco. And where did they go? Sacramento. People left New York City. Where did they go? Miami, the rest of Florida. So we saw these huge gravitational pulls away from some big, densely populated cities for very obvious reasons. A lot of people went to tax-free states. A lot of people in the US went to Sunbelt areas. We're starting to see that reverse. So yes, people are still moving to Phoenix. Yes, people are still moving to Austin, Texas, but the flow on net has slowed down, and that net outflow of people from places like San Francisco, New York, Boston, Chicago, you name it, Minneapolis, that has also slowed. So we're starting to see people return. Why do they go back to the big cities? Well, that's where the jobs are. And if you're a young singleton and you're 27, that's where the fun is, so that's where you go. So we're definitely seeing these trends reverse. And I would say that I do think flexibility is key for the workplace. That's the new mantra. Everybody wants it. Employers have to figure out how to provide it. And I would also say that don't bet against big cities. I think they're going to come back.
Great, thank you. So maybe I'll switch over to Barb. So just now, Karen mentioned employees, they love flexibility. What about employers? Do they love that too?
Yeah, so I'll tell you, give you a lot of the statistics really match up, Karen. So after health plans and retirement plans, which most job seekers say are table stakes, what employees want from their employer, the top three things are work-life balance, flexibility in the work schedule, and generous paid time off benefits. So that's probably not surprising. But when you ask employees how well are their employers doing with providing a good work-life balance, just over a third say it's excellent or very good, and 30% say it's fair or poor. So that's not a good sign that employers are actually figuring out what kinds of flexible programs employees want. But the good news is that employers are figuring out that they need to start kicking things into high gear. When we ask them what are the areas of focus for them over the next few years, 90% said work-life balance, 86% said stress reduction, and 88% said mental health and well-being. So they're at least heading in the right direction. So when we asked employees what contributes most to their feeling of a good work-life balance, it's number one, the number of hours that they work, and number two, schedule flexibility. After that, what I thought was interesting is after that, doing meaningful work or work they enjoy were number 3 and 4. I think that's interesting because we don't normally think of that necessarily as work-life balance, but that does play in really well. On remote work, interestingly, when we ask them, what are the top, what are the things you most value from your employer? Flexibility and work location came in number 6, which I think is very interesting and maybe a bit surprising. And that came behind flexibility in work schedule and opportunities for career advancement. So I think that's interesting. And our stats are pretty similar in that the number of workers who said they did not work from home at all went from 41% in 2021 to 61% in 2023. So that's a big jump in 2 years. And 23% say they are in a hybrid work environment. So that gives kind of a picture of what's happening from a flexibility standpoint.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. So it seems like there is a push and pull between the employers and the employees, because increasingly I see my husband works at Google, and then now they require workers to go back 3 days a week. And then, just a few months ago, it was like, once a week. So I think employers are pulling employees back because they increasingly notice there's a maybe declining productivity, or maybe they feel like they cannot really monitor the employees. So just a follow-up question for you, Barb. So you mentioned the percentage of employees not working from home completely are rising, right? Because they probably are answering to the employer's call, but do they want to do that? And if they have the chance, would they switch jobs or go find a flexible job? Or do you have data on that?
I think we're hearing a mix now. So as you said, the employers are pulling them back, and I think many workers are pushing back on that. But we're also starting to see that the younger generation, the Gen Zs, are actually starting to understand the value of being in an office and being able to get that training and mentoring directly and personally. So I think we actually are starting to see a bit of a shift from everyone always wanting to be at home to especially the newer employees, probably regardless of age, the newer employees who need to learn and grow and get trained and develop, they're actually seeing the value of being in the workplace. I don't know if you're seeing that as well.
Could I jump in? I don't want to cut you off, Amanda. I want to hear from Amanda too. It's exactly what you said. I just wanted to echo that. When we look at our data, we can look at it by generation because we can sort of tell how old you are based on how long you've been working or where you went to school and when. And it is exactly that. The Gen Zers and this is not just the US, globally, they actually are the ones who are most eager to go back to the office. As you can imagine, they probably live in the least nice house. They have to share the most of their space with someone else who's probably not that clean and no privacy. And then you go to the office and you might meet other people. You're going to learn a lot. You're going to have that face time to get ahead in your career. And so they were actually the ones who were pretty eager to go back to the office. And you can guess probably who was least eager was the parents of like the 11-year-old who needs to be picked up at 3 o'clock or go to the orthodontist appointment and all that nonsense we all have gone through probably at some point where your day is chopped up by a little kid's day. So they were the least likely to want to come back. And then the boomers, the older workers, were happy to go back because they remembered it. They were like, yeah, that's what it was. So there was just that one little sandwich generation, which is probably going to lead you to caregiving, but that really preferred.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I mean, you mentioned age. So last year I took, because on LinkedIn you can put in your, like, when you graduate from high school, I deliberately took that year off so that nobody can tell my age.
Sounds like you're suffering from a fear of ageism.
On myself. So I want to switch over to Amanda here. So I want to maybe ask you a little bit about government programs, because you work for Code for America, which works to modernize and digitalize government programs. And so what do you think government can do to support the flexible schedules that employees want?
So I think there's quite a bit that they've already done. Like when we think about the Affordable Care Act, right? And I see that my employees who come in and out, just the ability to get healthcare, which used to be a binding piece of what you did, really allows a lot of young folks or folks who want to have kids. Like now you can actually get off of your healthcare because there's an option. But one of the things I'm most excited about is really the modernization of government. So what the pandemic did for a lot of governments, both federal, local, and state, is that all of a sudden we can do things digitally, including deliver services digitally, in a way that it used to be Code for America would beg governments to start looking at. We think you can actually get school benefits programs digitally. And everyone said, that's a nice to have, but not right now. Pandemic happens and every single government had to think about school lunch programs, had to think about food assistance programs, housing assistance programs. The federal government had to think about how are we going to deploy a child tax credit system when people can't go into and get help from doing those forms. And so part of what I see right now as we think about governments and work with them is that we do have a new opportunity for two things. One is to redefine how people actually receive government services. So whether that's a mobile application, one of the things that Code for America did is we were the mobile app in Spanish and English for the child tax credit for people who had never filed before. Huge opportunity for not just young people who are used to their phone, but also older generation who couldn't go into an office as easily. And so what we're beginning to see is the simplification and accessibility of government systems. The second is technology allows you to actually reach people where maybe you hadn't reached them before, whether that's because there was a language barrier or whether that was because you just couldn't get to indigenous communities or they didn't show up in the data. Well, now we have the data and the systems to start to reach people where they are. And I think that's one of the most exciting things, at least that I'm seeing in our work with state governments and federal governments, is this idea of let's figure out where people are and then how do we reach them? And doing that in an equitable way where technology does actually allow you to target differently when you're trying to reach different communities. Again, whether that's language or just how you show up in the question you ask to different communities who might interpret that differently.
Just to follow up on that, that's great to hear. A lot of times we hear governments, they're still using technologies from the 80s, and it's the IRS. You read it on the news. They're underfunded, they're understaffed, and their computers were from the 1990s. So it's very difficult for them to do the tax season. So and Code for America seems like you guys have figured out. So what is your success recipe?
I'm not sure we figured this out. I wish someday, I hope when I come back in 2036, we have figured it out. But it really is meeting states where they are. And in some cases, it's taking exactly their legacy programs and just building a different front door. In some cases, it's actually like in the state of Minnesota, they wanted to combine 9 different services and have one portal because they noticed state capacity is coming down and they needed to do things more efficiently. And so technology allowed us to do that. Another good example that we're beginning to see is because the workforce is changing, because people are expecting now, particularly after COVID, expecting a different kind of relationship with government that can be digital. We are seeing governments say, wait a second, the pandemic health emergency ended. People are going off of Medicaid and they have to reapply. States are now saying, we don't have the caseworkers to help bring them on board. How can we do this from a technology standpoint? How can we not do forms and go mobile? And then they ask the question, can we just do an automatic renewal so it's slightly easier if we can match the data? And the answer is yes. And so partly what we're beginning to see is just the opening up of innovation. Now, not all states, but that opening up of innovation is really changing the conversation, the way things are working. We're not going to see it immediately, but there's certainly a heck of a lot more pilots and now positive case studies of how you can do this and potentially how you can deploy it in other states as well.
That's great to hear. So I want to switch gear to talk about caregiving, not just for our, basically for taking care of children, but also take care of our elderly parents. Because as we live longer, as Laura said earlier, we have multiple generations all live together. So especially for the sandwich generation like myself, you know, I have young children to support, but I also have to support elderly parents. So I want to maybe start with Karen. So with all the data that you have at LinkedIn, like what kind of big trends do you see among individual workers, especially women? Because usually caregiver, those tasks fall on the shoulders of women.
Yeah,
right?
Absolutely. So I think, I wish I could come back in a year and not 15 years, because we're about to kick off some work looking at older workers. And so we don't have anything yet on that front, but I will talk about women, what we see. We've done a lot on the Gen Z, because that's what everybody wanted to know about. And it's time to look at older workers. So what we see when we look at how things are shaping up, I think in some sense it's not surprising. So we see that women get sandwiched into this point where, and we know it, we all lived it, where you need to, what we found is women to get to where men are, need to sprint basically through their career in the first 10 years. They've got to get it all done, because at the 10-year mark, it's about the time when they need to go ahead and have that kid if they're planning on it, which means they have to step back and then they're going to get penalized, whether it's acknowledged or not. And then if they step all the way off, they have trouble finding a pathway and on-ramp back into the workplace. So women typically need to sprint the first 10 years, whereas men can kind of run more of a, you know, like a gentle pace and get to the same place 20 years later. So that we definitely see in our data, and that is pretty consistent across all the 200 countries and territories we look at. It's a little depressing. The other thing that we see is that obviously women taper off getting towards leadership. So there's a gap as women progress through their career, there's fewer and fewer of them reaching the C-suite. That's also, I think, well documented and not a surprise. And then we also, I'm going to like rattle off a couple of facts and I'll turn it over, but we also find that when you think about just STEM, because there's a lot of new jobs that have been created in the STEM field. And what we see is that most women who graduate with a STEM degree, so straight out of college, they're same identical training as a man, 2/3 of them don't even go into a STEM job. And we found that, McKinsey also found that. And I was actually talking to the woman at McKinsey. I was like, why do you think this is the case? And we're like, well, maybe they're getting turned off at the interview process. I don't know, but they're like not even going to a STEM job. They're immediately pivoting away out of those industries and out of those roles. So we're seeing that women are getting degreed more so than men in some cases, or as much as men, and yet they're not going into the same fields. They don't showcase themselves the same way in terms of the way they show their skills. So for the same job, same experience, a woman will highlight which skills she thinks are more important, and a man will highlight the skills he thinks is most important, and they'll choose completely different skill sets. So women will focus a lot on management, a lot of the people skills, and men will focus a lot more on like what you might call the technical skills. So there's a huge difference in how people also show up, even if they are equally skilled. But what I think was most interesting, and this is where I'll leave you, is so in the terms of longevity, we know that women are getting They're delaying having their first kid, generally speaking, in advanced economies. But they need to get all the traction they can as early as possible. And they also know that they're going to face ageism. And a lot of people are sort of anecdotally telling me they're facing it, who said, well, I stepped away and now I can't quite get back into work. I stepped away during the pandemic. I want to go back and I'm struggling. And these are very talented people. They've got deep networks and they can't quite get back, find an on-ramp back into work. So that definitely is something that we want to look into. And then here's my last point. None of these were a story. I apologize. I just wanted to share all these facts with you. One of the most interesting things we see about women in caregiving is that despite all of the extra attention they have to give to caregiving, whether it's younger people or older people in their family, that's caused two things. One, it's caused them to prefer remote work. So women apply to remote jobs more so than men consistently. Black women and Latina women also apply to remote work even more so than white women. And I suspect a lot of that is the appeal of the flexibility, the autonomy that they probably need. And we also see that women generally have less strong networks than men. So we can look at their professional network. And we know that networks are incredibly important for access to opportunity, generally speaking, in the professional world. But women's networks are less diverse. They have less experienced people in them. They're smaller. And they communicate less within each other. So a lot of that suggests that women are kind of struggling, one, against a structure of work that is not working for them perfectly. And also, I won't say struggling, but they're on the front line of adjusting to this phase where they are now caring for multiple people at once. And the woman who was on the stage before us mentioned the likelihood that a 20-year-old man would have his mother around versus the likelihood that a 20-year-old man would have his grandmother around, and how different that was in just 100 years. And so you can imagine the likelihood of someone who's 45, 50, they have a 10-year-old child maybe, and they have an 80-year-old parent. That probably wasn't very likely 30, 40 years ago. So I think they're adjusting to it. And I don't think all of the systems in our society are set up to support them.
Yeah. Seems like women are taking the biggest chunk of responsibility in terms of caregiving, especially women who are also want to have a career, right? So I want to switch to Barb. So at EBRI, you're looking at data from the employer side. So what do you think the employers can do to help support caregivers, and especially females who also want to have a career?
Sure. So in 2023, EBRI really double-clicked into caregiving in a number of our surveys. And our definition of caregiver, just to be clear, it's the National Alliance for Caregiving definition, which is unpaid care for an adult or a child with special needs. So we really weren't looking for the regular kind of parent-child role. Using that definition, 24% of American workers are caregivers. And there are some interesting demographic differences between caregivers and non-caregivers. As you said, they tended to be female. They are less likely to be married, and they report lower income levels than non-caregivers. And when it comes to thinking about retirement, caregivers are less confident that they'll have enough money to live comfortably in retirement, and they're less likely to have personally saved for retirement. More likely to say debt's a problem, and more likely to say that expenses in retirement are more than they expected. And it's really not surprising, because so many of these caregivers are not just providing emotional and physical support and helping with activities of daily living, they're actually providing financial support. Many of these adults are not able to handle the finances on their own, and these caregivers stepping in not only to manage, but actually to help out financially. In our survey, the average amount of time that a working caregiver spent on caregiving was 20 hours a week. And 40% say they expect to provide that care for the next 5 years. That's a lot of time that workers are spending caregiving. So what are employers doing to support them? The picture isn't great. 23% of employers offer specific child elder caregiving benefits. But there is light on the horizon again. 40% say that they plan to offer them going forward. The most commonly offered caregiver benefit is a leave policy versus providing benefits that actually help directly with providing care. So for example, 60% of employers allow for that flexible working, telecommuting, remote working, work schedule flexibility, which is incredibly important as we would expect for caregivers. 40% of employers offer long-term leave policies and paid family caregiver leave policies. And then since the pandemic, 50% of companies offer helper flexibility for families with childcare responsibilities, and 45% offer that flexibility for caring for others. And then just back to our discussion about flexibility, thinking about caregivers and what they need, they value that work schedule flexibility and work location flexibility as most important, while non-caregivers are really more about the hours they work and the kind of work they're doing. One thing that I think is really interesting, and I'll end with that, caregivers say it is very important to them to have a supportive supervisor. And we all need supportive supervisors, but they actually really call this out. And I think it's because many caregivers, unlike other DEI groups at work who will self-identify often proudly as that group, caregivers are uncomfortable saying, I'm a caregiver. They're actually nervous that there will be negative connotations for what that means for their dedication and focus on work. So one of the best practices that we're seeing is employers setting up employee resource groups for caregivers. And actually, I think it was more than 70% of employers actually either offer or plan to offer some kind of caregiver employee resource group for that group. So I think that's actually a really interesting and important step forward.
So you mentioned some employers provide options for the employees to take care of their elderly parents or families. I guess not all the employers are financially capable to do that, right? Especially small business owners. So I guess that's when the government can step in and probably can play a role. So I want to maybe ask Amanda, like, what do you think the government can do in this domain?
So there was an interesting, this past administration, an executive order that looked at, and it was an experiment by this administration to look at the life experiences of people, right? And they broke it up into 5. They ended up doing 9 projects. And it was things like caregiving, being ready for retirement, financial shock, emerging from a disaster. And the idea was to try and get different agencies to say, how do we all play at this moment in a person's life? I will say it was tough, but that way of thinking, right, is all of a sudden now building programs where you're actually combining HHS, which is healthcare, right, with agriculture, food assistance and nutrition programs. How do we actually do that with the idea that you're trying to help a senior or a mom or a caregiver come to be able to do that body of work, and how can the government help support that? There were a couple of programs, projects that mostly came out with the idea that you have to make these sources simple and accessible. But the reality is it's really a distribution by the state level or a community-based process that you need to do, although it could be funded by the federal government. So I do think we could see, especially as we start to see what other countries do around the world, is we could begin to see some of these aging programs where you're bringing agencies together to distribute something at the state or local level for caregivers in a real way.
Thank you. I have a lot more questions, but I want to make sure we have opportunity for the online audience.
Let's see, we have a question from the online audience. How do your workplace studies translate to specific non-office industries like hospital care, nursing homes, which already have issues with large hospitals, pay care work situation, et cetera, and where there's already a scarcity of professionals?
Yeah,
Karen
sure.
has it.
I can start. She can flex too. So I would say it's true that, correct me if I get this wrong, because I'm not sure of my number, but I think, roughly half of all occupations are not ones that can be remote. So there are many people who are working in places where there's no remote option. And think about hotels or hospitals and things like that, where you have to actually show up. But when we look at how people navigate the world of work, what we find, and I actually want to call on what Barb was highlighting, which is there are multiple ways to think about flexibility and autonomy. And what people really want is to feel invested in. They want to feel like they have control of their schedule, and have the ability to like roll with the random unexpected shock, which could be a minor shock of like the daily schedule, or it could be a big shock. And I think all workplaces are really obliged to kind of think about how do they provide that to talent if they want to retain them. So whether we're talking about a young person or an older person, whether we're talking about a woman or a man, a caregiver or not, everybody wants that autonomy and flexibility. And I think that most of the roles, whether they are in person or remote, that's the shift that we've seen underlying everything.
Yeah, and the only thing I would add to that is, again, there's work location flexibility, but even in the jobs that you were describing there, kind of as you're saying, there still is the possibility for work schedule flexibility. And for example, there are some innovative organizations that are allowing people to swap schedules with each other, to pick based on points. So if you work the weekend, for example, that's more points. And if somebody wants to trade with you. So I do think, even though in those cases work location can't be flexible, there still are so many ways to create that sense of work schedule flexibility that would be very appealing to those workers.
Yeah, and can I add on and also like the dignity. I have a friend whose younger cousin works for a big supermarket chain you've all heard of. And it used to be the case that he had to log on Sunday nights to see what his schedule was, or to like sign up quickly. And if you missed his window, someone else would take it. And then you have the worst schedule for the next week. So he could never plan anything. And this is an adult who wants to have some dignity, ability to plan, and was completely at the whim of like this arbitrary time, and they had to like sign up. And it was a game changer when finally, one, you didn't have to sign up in person and they made it electronic. And then two, they allowed for people to switch and work amongst themselves how they wanted to allocate the time. And these were like novel, unbelievably things that people didn't have the dignity of having as adults, even 5 years ago.
Amanda? No.
I mean, I think I have a very young, we have a very young workforce, and we do experiment with open PTO. We do have a sabbatical after 4 years where we really want you to not do work and we really turn off the systems for you to go. But I think all of, like, as an employer, that's just the beginning, I think, of what we can do to be creative. We have co-paring on jobs, things like that, that I think the younger generation is asking us to do, but also you see a different joy and productivity in the work itself as well.
So I want to close the session by asking each one of you to give a 1 minute, just to share with us your last thought on how the system can be improved from the individual, from the government, from the employer perspective. So maybe we can start with you, Barb.
Sure. I feel like one of the things that I love about the EBRI studies is we ask employers and employees the same questions so that we can actually really find out what they both want and where expectations aren't aligned. And I feel like we should be doing more of that. So I think sometimes employers are operating in a bit of a vacuum. They're not entirely clear what employees want to need, and employees aren't always comfortable sharing what they want. So hopefully more transparency and joining together of expectations can really move things forward.
Great, thanks.
I would like to share with you that one of our observations is that there's so many different skills that go into a job, and the technical skills are changing rapidly, and they're changing more rapidly than they were before. I'm not even trying to scare anybody, because I work in a big AI company and I have no idea about it. I'm an economist, but I do try to push myself to be AI literate. And so my 1 minute answer is it would be nice to see more ways for people to upskill themselves in little tiny digestible bite-sized fashion that works for their schedule, whether they're a working parent or a caregiver, or they just don't have a flexible schedule to do it. And that would be affordable and empowering, and whether that's provided by the employer, which is probably a great thing because the employer knows what skills they're looking for, but also educational institutions to provide multiple, affordable, accessible on-ramps for people of all backgrounds to upskill themselves in tiny increments that work for them. I would love to see that because technological change is coming. It's going to accelerate. We're all going to need more and more of that. And it's ridiculous to think we need to leave people behind because their lifestyle isn't set up for the way we teach. So.
I like
Thank you.
that. I will add representing the government. Number one, it is election day. So please tell people who have to vote today to vote. And I mean that on two different levels. One is honestly vote, but two, engage. Like the reality is government is changing and it's going to change by the people who are engaged in it, whether that is voting or whether that's the policies they do or whether that's people working in government. What I have seen from my time of now working 20 years in government in different ways is that government is opening itself more to academics, more to people after retirement, not just a place you go to retire. And I think the only way we get our institutions back to where they should be is that we are engaging cross-generationally. We are thinking about it as a place you can go make a difference, come in and out of it. And so I welcome folks to come into this space because that's how we get our institutions back in a trusted place.
Thank you so much.